Hi everyone, for those of you who don't know Prager University, they run a very large YouTube channel, and despite their name, they're not actually a university. They describe themselves as a non-profit organization, but really they're just a vehicle for right-wing propaganda, and they promote many anti-scientific beliefs, like the belief in God. They deny that humans are responsible for climate change, and one of the founders of Prager University, Dennis Prager, does not believe in the theory of evolution, and instead believes in intelligent design.
And my position for most of my life was, okay, God created evolution. I have no issue.
So you can concurrently believe in those two things.
Yes, but it's not my position any longer because I simply know more science. And the science on evolution is not nearly as established as people think it is. Because the paleontologists themselves are not so certain that it occurred in anywhere near the way they believe it did.
And with Prager University's history of giving false, misleading, and anti-scientific information, I knew I was going to have a laugh when I saw they uploaded a video titled, "How the Government Made You Fat." Well, Dennis Prager, unless the government is giving you Oreo cookies after you file your tax returns, I don't think you can blame them for making you fat.
Here's a riddle. How is it that ever since the government began telling us what to eat, we've gotten fatter and sicker?
Well, that's not much of a riddle because the answer is pretty obvious. The reason Americans are getting fatter despite the government giving out dietary recommendations is because people aren't following the government's dietary recommendations. If you take a look at the USDA dietary guidelines, they recommend eating primarily whole foods with a variety of fruits and vegetables and limiting intake of processed sugar and saturated fat. Do you honestly believe that your average overweight American is eating a diet primarily consisting of whole foods with a variety of fruits and vegetables with a limited intake of processed sugar and saturated fat? I think the answer is an obvious no, and what's even more absurd is that the narrator of this video is assuming that your average American is even familiar with the USDA dietary guidelines. It's a 122-page document. What are the chances that your average American would be more negatively influenced by a 120-page document on nutrition put out by the government, or the thousands of advertisements for processed food that they're bombarded with on a daily basis? Maybe that's kind of the reason why we have government dietary guidelines, to at least counteract some of the bad information being put out by these private corporations, incentivizing people to eat absolute garbage that is actually contributing to obesity. So, you're not really making a great case for the government making us fat here.
Surely there had to be a scientific solution to heart disease. There was. And a charismatic medical researcher from the University of Minnesota named Ancel Keys had it. Cholesterol, Keys claimed, was the villain of the heart disease story. His now famous 7-country study determined conclusively, in his mind at least, that people who consumed high amounts of fat, specifically saturated fat, had higher cholesterol levels and thus higher rates of heart attacks. There was only one problem. Keys' study was bad science. The sample size was so small, the data collection integrity so shoddy, and the lifestyle variables between the countries he studied so great that his research had no scientific validity.
So this is a great example of how Prager University cherry picks and misrepresents information to promote their anti-scientific agenda. So they're talking about Ancel Keys and the 7-country study. How is that at all relevant to the discussion? Ancel Keys' 7-country study started back in 1958. Well, guess what? We have more recent data on saturated fat, cholesterol, and heart disease. So why are they cherry-picking a study from over 60 years ago? In 2017, the American Heart Association published this paper where they found that based on the most recent randomized control trials, lowering the intake of saturated fat and replacing it with polyunsaturated vegetable oil reduced cardiovascular disease by 30%. And just this year, the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition found that based on 47 systematic reviews and meta-analyses, higher saturated fat consumption is linked to raised blood cholesterol, and higher intakes of saturated fat are associated with an increased risk of heart disease. And in 2017, the European Atherosclerosis Society published this paper where they found that separate meta-analyses of over 200 prospective cohort studies, Mendelian randomization studies, and randomized trials, including more than 2 million participants with over 20 million person-years of follow-up and over 150,000 cardiovascular events, demonstrate a remarkably consistent dose-dependent log linear association between the absolute magnitude of exposure of the vasculature to LDL-C and the risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So based on the most recent, relevant, and up-to-date information, saturated fat and elevated serum cholesterol do in fact cause heart disease. So it doesn't matter if Ancel Keys and his 7-country study was terrible, doesn't matter if his study had flawed methodology, doesn't matter if it was non-scientific. Ancel Keys, it turns out, was right. Saturated fat and cholesterol do in fact contribute to heart disease, and that is supported by the most recent relevant research. So rather than criticizing the most recent reviews and meta-analyses on saturated fat, cholesterol, and heart disease, what PragerU did was cherry-pick a study from over 60 years ago, claimed it has bad methodology and is non-scientific, so that they could dishonestly paint this narrative that, oh, saturated fat and cholesterol is fine for you, while ignoring the actual recent relevant research.
In 1973, the American Heart Association set the dietary limit on saturated fat at 10%. And in 1977, the US government followed suit. Where did the 10% value come from? It didn't come from any scientific data. It was merely a government committee's best guess.
So notice what Prager University is doing here. Rather than actually trying to prove that the 10% limit recommendation on saturated fat is a bad recommendation, they're just giving you irrelevant information about this that, oh, it was just made up, there was no scientific basis behind it when it was originally introduced. Well, that doesn't actually matter, does it? What matters is whether or not it's a bad recommendation. And again, this year, the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition found that based on 47 systematic reviews and meta-analyses, higher saturated fat consumption is linked to raised blood cholesterol, and higher intakes of saturated fat are associated with increased risk of heart disease, and they found no reason to change the guideline to limit saturated fat consumption to no more than 10% of calories. So, again, based on the most relevant recent information, there is no reason to change the recommendation on saturated fat to no more than 10% of calories. So what are you arguing here?
This was despite contrary evidence like the 1957 Western Electric Company employee study, showing no difference in heart attacks in those who ate more or less saturated fat. A longer-term study of the same Western Electric subjects in 1981 reached the same conclusion. But again, no one wanted to hear it.
So he's doing the exact same thing again. He's cherry-picking a study that's over 60 years old and another study that's almost 40 years old. I don't like repeating myself, but again, based on the most recent randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews and meta-analyses, saturated fat does in fact increase risk of heart disease. You can't just cherry-pick studies that are twice as old as I am and then claim that, oh yes, nobody wants to listen, nobody's listening to this data, when there are systematic reviews and meta-analyses showing that saturated fat is in fact harmful to heart health. It's a higher level of scientific evidence. You keep ignoring higher levels of scientific evidence because it doesn't suit your agenda. You are cherry-picking dishonest liars.
As Americans ate less saturated fat, margarine instead of butter, processed oils like corn oil instead of olive oil, low-fat milk, low-fat yogurt, and so on, they also started to eat more heart-healthy grains, exactly what the food pyramid and the updated version called MyPlate advise you to do. As the consumption of saturated fat decreased by almost 40%, the consumption of refined grains, carbohydrates that convert to sugar in the body, increased substantially.
Okay, so now this guy has resorted to lying about the USDA recommendations to keep pushing this saturated fat is good agenda. The USDA does not recommend eating refined grains. They recommend eating primarily whole grains, which have been proven to reduce heart disease risk. They also don't recommend consuming any margarines due to their trans fat content, and they also recommend using oils to replace saturated fats that are solid at room temperature. They don't recommend adding oils to the diet, and they also state that oils should only make up a small portion of your total daily calories. So the only way for your argument to work is if you cherry pick bad, outdated information and you lie about the USDA dietary recommendations, which is just hilariously ironic because you're claiming Americans are failing following the USDA dietary guidelines when you don't even know what the freaking dietary guidelines are.
Total intake of calories also began to increase. This happened in no small part because food companies took advantage of the low-fat craze. They lowered fat and increased sugar.
The USDA dietary guidelines recommends minimizing sugar consumption, so this is in complete opposition to what the USDA dietary guidelines recommends. So you literally just debunked your own argument. You're claiming that the government is responsible for the obesity epidemic? Well, no, you just said private corporations are misinforming the public, creating these processed junk foods, and through this misinformation campaign, they're tricking people into buying processed junk foods that are contributing to the obesity epidemic. How stupid can you be?
How do we get ourselves out of this spiral? There are many answers. For some, it's a low-carb, high-fat diet. For others, it's a Mediterranean diet. For some, it's vegetarianism. For others, it might be something else. You need to find the best solution for you.
You just made a video about obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease, but you didn't think to mention that vegans have the lowest risk of obesity, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes out of any diet group. So maybe that's the diet we should be all following, huh? And if you like this video, maybe consider supporting me on Patreon or through my website. I have some funding perks you may find interesting. If you're looking for clothing, then check out the Vegan Gains store. And if you're looking for online coaching, then check out Quality Gains. He offers customized meal and training programs. Just click the link in the description down below. And as always, keep making those vegan gains.